Have you ever noticed that wanting never really ends? That the moment one desire is satisfied, another quietly takes its place. That relief feels brief, almost accidental, while dissatisfaction feels permanent, structural, built into the very fabric of being alive. You achieve something, you obtain something, you reach a moment you once imagined would finally calm you, and then, almost immediately, the restlessness returns. Not as a shock, but as a familiar weight. As if life itself is designed to withhold lasting peace. This is not a personal failure. It is not a lack of gratitude. It is not a flaw in your character. Arthur Schopenhauer saw this long before modern psychology gave it polite terminology. He saw that existence itself is driven by an endless blind force of wanting, a will that pushes us forward without ever explaining why. We desire because we are alive. And because we desire, we suffer, not occasionally, constantly, subtly, in ways that become so familiar we mistake them for normality. Most philosophies try to soothe this realization. They tell you to think positively, to manifest abundance, to chase happiness harder, to optimize yourself until fulfillment finally arrives. Schopenhauer did the opposite. He refused to anesthetize the wound. He insisted on looking directly at the structure of existence and naming it honestly. Life, at its core, is not a journey toward happiness. It is a struggle to manage dissatisfaction. Pleasure is not the rule, it is the exception. And suffering is not an accident, it is the baseline. This perspective feels dark only because it strips away illusions that most people rely on to stay functional. Schopenhauer understood that optimism is often not wisdom, but avoidance, a way of refusing to acknowledge how fragile, repetitive, and exhausting the human condition truly is. To see this clearly is not to become bitter, it is to become awake. And awakening is rarely comfortable. If you feel disconnected from shallow positivity, if success stories ring hollow, if the promise of more leaves you colder rather than motivated, it may be because you have already sensed what Schopenhauer articulated with brutal precision, that life does not naturally move toward fulfillment, but toward repetition. Wanting, achieving, losing interest, wanting again. A loop that only ends with exhaustion, resignation, or death. And yet, Schopenhauer was not merely a philosopher of despair. He was a diagnostician. He believed that once you understand the true nature of suffering, you stop blaming yourself for it. You stop chasing fantasies sold to keep you compliant. You begin to value silence over noise, depth over excitement, compassion over competition. You stop asking how to win at life and start asking how to endure it with honesty and dignity. This is the threshold his philosophy places you at. Not a promise of happiness, but an invitation to clarity. Not a roadmap to success, but a mirror held uncomfortably close. To understand life the Schopenhauer way is not to give up, it is to stop lying to yourself about what you are up against. And from that honesty, something strange emerges. Not joy, but calm. Not fulfillment, but relief. The relief of no longer expecting life to be what it never was. Number 1. You feel desire never truly satisfies you. Have you ever noticed that wanting never ends, it only changes its costume? But the moment you get what you thought you needed, the relief fades faster than you expected, leaving behind a quiet disappointment you can't quite name. You wanted the job, the relationship, the money, the recognition, the freedom. You told yourself, when I get this, things will finally settle. And for a brief moment, maybe they did. But then the restlessness returned. It always does. Schopenhauer understood this as the central tragedy of human existence. Desire, he argued, is not a path to fulfillment. It is the mechanism of suffering itself. To desire is to lack. And as long as you are alive, you will lack something. The will that drives you forward does not care about your happiness. It only cares about continuation. It pushes you to want, again and again, without ever explaining why or where this motion is supposed to end. This is why satisfaction feels so fragile. It was never meant to last. The moment a desire is fulfilled, it collapses under its own weight. Either boredom replaces it, or a new desire quietly emerges in its place. You don't move from dissatisfaction to peace. You move from one form of dissatisfaction to another. Achievement does not free you. It only resets the cycle. Most people refuse to see this. They mistake desire for motivation, ambition for meaning, hunger for purpose. Society encourages this blindness because a person who believes fulfillment is just one more achievement away is easy to manage. They keep working, they keep chasing, they keep hoping. And when they feel empty again, they blame themselves instead of questioning the system that taught them to equate wanting with living. Schopenhauer did not offer comfort here. He offered clarity. Desire, in his view, is a curse built into consciousness itself. Animals suffer less because they desire less abstractly. Humans, burdened with imagination and memory, suffer more because they can anticipate loss, regret the past, and fantasize endlessly about futures that never quite arrive. Awareness amplifies dissatisfaction. The smarter you are, the more sharply you feel the inadequacy of fulfillment. This is why even success can feel hollow. You climb, you reach, you win, and then you look around and realize nothing fundamental has changed. You are still you, still restless, still pulled forward by a force that does not negotiate. Schopenhauer would say, "Of course you are." Desire was never trying to complete you. It was only using you. Understanding this does not make life joyful, but it does make it honest. You stop expecting desire to save you. You stop confusing relief with meaning. You stop believing that the next thing will finally fix the unease you carry. Instead, you begin to see desire for what it is: a pressure to be managed, not a guide to be trusted. In this realization, there is a strange kind of freedom. When you no longer believe satisfaction is the goal, you stop being manipulated by promises of more. You become less reactive, less desperate, less easily seduced. You begin to value stillness over stimulation, sufficiency over excess, restraint over indulgence. Not because you are virtuous, but because you are tired of being deceived. Schopenhauer's insight cuts deep. Life does not disappoint you because you failed to desire correctly. Life disappoints you because desire itself is the problem. And once you see this, you stop chasing illusions and start negotiating existence on more realistic terms. You don't expect happiness. You aim for reduction of suffering. You don't expect fulfillment. You seek moments of quiet. You don't expect peace from wanting. You look for it in release. That is the first sign you understand life the Schopenhauer way. Number 2, you notice pleasure fades faster than pain, and you know why. Why moments of joy pass quickly, while suffering seems to stretch, echo, and repeat itself long after the original cause is gone. You laugh one day and forget it the next, but a humiliation, a loss, a betrayal, those stay. They embed themselves. They shape how you move through the world. Schopenhauer did not see this as pessimism. He saw it as mathematics. Pleasure, he argued, is merely the temporary absence of pain. It is not a positive state, it is a pause. Hunger relieved, loneliness softened, fear postponed. The moment the pressure eases, we call it happiness. But because pressure inevitably returns, pleasure cannot last. Pain, on the other hand, has weight. It asserts itself. It demands attention. It leaves marks. This asymmetry is not a flaw in your psychology. It is the structure of existence. Think about it. A good meal satisfies you briefly. Hunger returns. But a chronic illness, a broken heart, a deep insecurity, these can dominate your inner world for years. Pleasure asks little of you. Pain consumes you entirely. And because life is driven by endless wanting, dissatisfaction has far more opportunities to reappear than satisfaction does. Modern culture tries to deny this reality. It sells happiness as a permanent state you can achieve if you try hard enough, think positively enough, optimize efficiently enough. When that promise fails, as it inevitably does, you are told the problem is your mindset. Schopenhauer rejected this cruelty. He understood that asking life to feel good more than it feels bad is like asking gravity to pull upward. Pain lingers because it is informative. It warns, it conditions, it shapes survival. Pleasure fades because it has done its job the moment it removes discomfort. There is no evolutionary reason for it to stay. The nervous system remembers threats far better than delights. Existence prioritizes continuation, not contentment. Once you see this, you stop being surprised by disappointment. You stop feeling betrayed when happiness doesn't last. You understand that joy was never meant to be a destination. It was a brief interruption in the ongoing management of suffering. This realization can feel heavy, but it can also be stabilizing. When you stop expecting pleasure to endure, you stop clinging to it desperately. You enjoy it when it comes, without demanding that it stay. And when pain arrives, as it always does, you don't interpret it as failure. You recognize it as the default condition asserting itself again. Schopenhauer believed this understanding cultivates humility. It makes you gentler with yourself and others. You realize that most people are not cruel because they want to be. They are exhausted, frustrated, disappointed creatures trying to relieve their own discomfort. Compassion, in this view, is not moral superiority. It is recognition of shared suffering. You also stop building your life around pleasure-seeking. You stop worshiping excitement, novelty, stimulation. You see how quickly they decay, how little they protect you when pain arrives. Instead, you begin to value stability, simplicity, quiet routines, solitude. Not because they are exciting, but because they hurt less. To notice that pleasure fades faster than pain is to stop arguing with reality. It is to accept that life is weighted toward difficulty, and that expecting otherwise only compounds suffering. Schopenhauer did not ask you to despair over this. He asked you to adapt, lower expectations, reduce unnecessary desire, seek peace, not happiness, endurance, not fulfillment. This is not a popular philosophy. It does not sell well. But for those who have already felt the imbalance, those who have noticed how fleeting joy is and how persistent pain can be, it feels less like pessimism and more like recognition. Number 3, you feel smarter people suffer more, and you are no longer confused by it. Have you ever noticed that the people who think the most often seem the least at ease? That intelligence does not bring peace, but tension. That awareness sharpens joy only briefly, while it deepens suffering permanently. Schopenhauer saw this long before modern psychology confirmed it. To him, intelligence was not a blessing. It was an amplifier. The more aware you are, the more you see. And the more you see, the harder it becomes to participate comfortably in life's illusions. A less reflective mind can move through the world buffered by habit, tradition, optimism, and distraction. It believes in progress, fairness, destiny, and happy endings. It takes social narratives at face value and finds comfort in routine. But a sharper mind does not have this luxury. It notices contradictions. It recognizes patterns. It connects causes to outcomes others prefer not to examine. And once this awareness takes root, innocence is permanently lost. Schopenhauer argued that suffering increases in direct proportion to consciousness. Animals suffer less, not because their lives are easier, but because their awareness is narrower. Humans hurt. He said it will. Because to understand life clearly is to see how little of it is designed for human fulfillment. Intelligence removes the anesthetic. It exposes the raw nerve existence. This is also why intelligent people are more prone to melancholy, pessimism, and withdrawal. not because they are weak, but because they are less protected. They cannot fully believe the stories that keep others afloat. They know how easily happiness collapses, how fragile identity is, how quickly meaning dissolves under scrutiny. Awareness corrodes certainty. Society often mislabels this as negativity, but Schopenhauer would say it is accuracy. A clear mirror does not distort reality just because the reflection is unpleasant. Intelligence does not create suffering, it reveals it. And yet, within this bleak recognition, there is a form of dignity. To suffer consciously is different from suffering blindly. The intelligent sufferer is not shocked by disappointment. They are not outraged by unfairness. They are not destabilized by loss in the same way, because they never expected existence to be kind. Their suffering is quieter, deeper, more resigned. This is why Schopenhauer valued intellectual honesty over comfort. He believed it was better to see clearly and suffer than to live pleasantly deceived. For those who resonate with this, intelligence is not a gift to be celebrated. It is a burden to be carried with restraint, humility, and realism. If you've noticed that understanding more has not made you happier, but more cautious, more reserved, more inward, you are not broken. You are simply awake in a world that rewards sleep. That, unmistakably, is a Schopenhauerian insight. Number 4. You see life as a cycle of wanting and disappointment, and you have stopped expecting resolution. Have you ever felt like life doesn't actually progress, but loops? That every solution quietly becomes a new problem. Every arrival turns into another departure. Every fulfillment dissolves into fresh dissatisfaction. You move forward in time, but internally, the pattern feels unchanged. Want. Attain. Feel relief. Feel empty again. Repeat. Schopenhauer believed this cycle was the core structure of existence. Life, in his view, is not a journey toward fulfillment. It is an oscillation between desire and disappointment. When desire dominates, you suffer from lack. When desire is temporarily satisfied, you suffer from boredom. Either way, suffering remains. Fulfillment is not a stable state. It is a brief transition between two forms of unease. This is why nothing ever feels like enough. Love, not success, not comfort, not freedom. Each achievement promises closure, but delivers only pause. The will the blind force driving existence does not stop once a goal is reached. It simply shifts direction. You are never allowed to rest inside satisfaction. The mechanism won't permit it. Most people interpret this as personal failure. Why am I still restless? Why am I still dissatisfied? Why does nothing last? Schopenhauer removes the self-blame entirely. This is not your flaw. It is the design. The tragedy is that society teaches the opposite. It insists life is a ladder. Climb high enough, and peace awaits. But Schopenhauer saw that even those at the top are still driven, still anxious, still dissatisfied, only now with more complex desires and more elaborate disappointments. The cycle does not end with success. It accelerates. Once you truly see this, something shifts. You stop chasing resolution. You stop expecting a final chapter where everything settles into harmony. You recognize that life is maintenance, not fulfillment, endurance, not completion. This does not lead to despair. It leads to realism. When you no longer expect life to satisfy you, you stop demanding that it do so. You stop feeling betrayed by its repetition. You stop treating disappointment as catastrophe. It becomes whether unpleasant, recurring, but unsurprising. Schopenhauer believed wisdom begins when you stop asking life to justify itself. When you stop insisting it provide meaning, happiness, or fairness. The moment you accept that wanting will always return, you stop being shocked by its presence. You begin to manage it instead of obeying it. This is also why detachment becomes appealing, not because you no longer care, but because caring indiscriminately feeds the cycle. Every attachment creates a new vulnerability. Every expectation creates a future disappointment. Reducing desire reduces suffering, not to zero, but to survivable levels. Seeing life as cyclical, rather than progressive, strips away fantasy, but it grants composure. You don't panic when fulfillment fades. You don't romanticize beginnings or mourn endings excessively. You recognize the pattern and move within it carefully. To live the Schopenhauer way is not to hope for resolution. It is to accept repetition, not to seek completion, but to minimize unnecessary pain. If you've stopped believing that the next thing will finally fix everything, if you then notice that wanting itself never ends, you are no longer confused by life's structure. You are seeing it as it is. Number 5. You feel disconnected from shallow optimism, and you no longer apologize for it. Have you ever felt uneasy around people who insist everything will be fine? Not reassured, not comforted, but quietly irritated. As if their smiles are too quick, their positivity too rehearsed, their certainty too cheap. Schopenhauer understood this reaction deeply. To him, shallow optimism was not harmless, it was a form of denial. Optimism, in its popular form, is not wisdom. It is anesthesia. It tells people that suffering is temporary, that everything happens for a reason, that happiness is the natural state of life if you just think correctly. But Schopenhauer rejected this entirely. He believed optimism was a philosophical error, born from comfort, privilege, or fear, a refusal to look directly at the structure of existence. If life were fundamentally oriented toward happiness, suffering would be the exception. But suffering is not the exception, it is the baseline. Illness, aging, loss, boredom, anxiety, disappointment, grief. These are not glitches in the system. They are the system. Optimism treats them as accidents. Schopenhauer treated them as evidence. This is why shallow positivity feels insulting once you see clearly. It minimizes pain by reframing it instead of acknowledging it. It tells you to smile when honesty would demand silence. It pressures you to perform emotional wellness in a world that provides very little reason for it. Schopenhauer did not argue that people should be miserable. He argued that pretending life is benevolent makes suffering worse, not better. Because when pain inevitably arrives, the optimist feels betrayed, confused, and unprepared. The pessimist, by contrast, is rarely shocked. They expected resistance. They expected loss. They expected dissatisfaction, and expectation shapes endurance. Disconnection from optimism is often mistaken for cynicism. But cynicism mocks life. Schopenhauer did not mock it. He took it seriously. He believed that false hope is more dangerous than despair, because it blinds people to reality and leaves them emotionally fragile. Real strength comes from knowing what you are dealing with. This is why shallow optimism feels hollow. It skips over reality instead of standing inside it. It demands emotional conformity. It refuses to sit with discomfort. It treats sadness as failure rather than insight. When you stop participating in this collective pretense, you may feel isolated. Conversations feel thin. Advice feels useless. Encouragement feels misplaced. People tell you to be more positive, when what they really mean is, don't disturb the illusion. Schopenhauer would say this isolation is the cost of clarity. To see life clearly is to accept that it is not designed for happiness, but for continuation. The will does not care if you are fulfilled. It only cares that you keep wanting. Optimism interferes with this understanding by suggesting a destination that does not exist. Once you detach from shallow positivity, something quiet but profound happens. You stop forcing emotional states. You stop feeling guilty for realism. You stop measuring your inner life against motivational slogans and social expectations. You also become more compassionate, not the loud, performative kind, but the honest kind. Because when you no longer deny suffering, you can actually recognize it in others. You stop offering platitudes and start offering presence. You don't rush people through pain. You respect it. Schopenhauer believed that realism is not cruel, it is merciful. It prepares you. It grounds you. It allows you to suffer without the added burden of confusion. If optimism no longer comforts you, it does not mean you are broken. It means you have stopped lying to yourself. And that is not darkness. That is clarity. Number 6, you find comfort in solitude because noise no longer feels like life. Have you ever noticed that solitude doesn't frighten you the way it used to? That silence feels safer than conversation. That being alone feels less draining than being surrounded by people who expect performance, enthusiasm, and constant engagement. Schopenhauer believed this was not withdrawal, it was alignment. For him, solitude was not an escape from life. It was a refuge from its excess. Most people fear being alone because silence forces confrontation with thoughts, with dissatisfaction, with the raw texture of existence. Noise, social, digital, emotional, acts as a buffer. It distracts. It numbs. It fills the space where uncomfortable truths might surface. But once you've seen enough, noise loses its appeal. Schopenhauer argued that the quality of a mind determines its relationship with solitude. Shallow minds crave constant stimulation because stillness reveals emptiness. Deeper minds seek solitude because it offers relief from triviality. This is not elitism, it is temperament shaped by awareness. In solitude, there is no performance, no social calculation, no emotional labor, no need to explain yourself, defend your realism, or soften your honesty. You are allowed to exist without justification. That alone is restorative. Society often frames solitude as loneliness, but Schopenhauer made a sharp distinction. Loneliness is the pain of unwanted isolation. Solitude is the peace of chosen distance. One is deprivation, the other is freedom. When you begin to prefer solitude, it usually follows disillusionment. You have seen enough superficial conversations, enough repeated patterns, enough performative emotions. You've noticed how rarely people actually listen, how often they speak to be seen, not to understand. Over time, engagement starts to feel like friction. Solitude removes that friction. It also restores proportion. Away from social noise, desires soften. Comparisons fade. Ambitions lose their urgency. The will quiets not completely, but enough to breathe. Schopenhauer believed this quieting was essential. The less the will dominates consciousness, the less intensely one suffers. This is why solitude feels calming rather than empty. It reduces stimulation and with it, desire. You are no longer constantly reminded of what you lack, what you should want, who you should be. You return to a more neutral state. There is also honesty in solitude. No one is watching. No one is validating or judging. What remains is what is real. This can be uncomfortable at first, but over time, it becomes stabilizing. You learn to tolerate your own thoughts, to coexist with dissatisfaction without panic. Schopenhauer himself lived much of his life alone, not out of bitterness, but out of preference. He believed that most suffering comes from entanglement expectations, attachments, social obligations, emotional dependencies. Solitude reduces these entanglements. This does not mean rejecting humanity. It means limiting exposure, choosing depth over frequency, silence over noise, presence over performance. When solitude becomes comforting, it is often because you have stopped needing the world to distract you from yourself. You have accepted that life is not a constant celebration, and you no longer demand that it be one. In solitude, you are not happy in the conventional sense. You are calm. And for Schopenhauer, calm was far more valuable. If you find yourself drawn to quiet rooms, long walks, empty spaces, and uninterrupted thought, not out of sadness, but relief, you are not withdrawing from life. You are learning how to endure it with less unnecessary pain. Number 7. You use art, music, or beauty to escape reality, even if only briefly. A piece of music that makes time dissolve. A painting that quiets your inner noise. A film, a poem, a melody that doesn't solve anything, yet somehow makes life bearable for a few minutes. Schopenhauer believed this was not accidental. He believed art was one of the only honest respites from the suffering built into existence. For Schopenhauer, art was not decoration. It was anesthesia. Life, as he saw it, is governed by the will, a blind, restless force that drives desire, striving, competition, hunger, ambition, fear. This will never rests. Even when satisfied, it immediately creates new demands. And because of this, ordinary consciousness is almost always tense, dissatisfied, and pressured forward. Art interrupts this process. When you are deeply absorbed in music, beauty, or aesthetic contemplation, something unusual happens. You stop wanting. Not permanently, not completely, but long enough to feel relief. The will loosens its grip. You are no longer calculating, comparing, craving, fearing. You are simply perceiving. Schopenhauer believed this was one of the highest states a human could experience. This is why art feels like escape, not because it distracts you, but because it silences the internal command to desire. It gives you a rare experience of existence without striving, a glimpse of consciousness without pressure. Notice how different this is from entertainment. Entertainment stimulates desire. It excites, distracts, consumes. Art, in Schopenhauer's sense, does the opposite. It stills. It removes urgency. It creates a distance between you and the compulsive need to want something else. This is why certain music feels almost sacred. It bypasses language, bypasses logic, bypasses ambition. It speaks directly to the structure of suffering itself. Schopenhauer famously believed music was the highest art because it expressed the will without representing the world. It mirrored existence without adding illusion. When you turn to art, you are not being indulgent. You are seeking relief from the constant strain of being a wanting creature. People often criticize this as escapism. Schopenhauer would say they misunderstand the problem. The issue is not that people escape reality. The issue is that reality offers very little rest. Art provides a pause, a momentary suspension of the machine. This is why beauty feels bittersweet. You know it will end. You know the pressure will return. And yet, during those moments, life feels lighter. Not meaningful in a grand sense, but tolerable. And tolerance, Schopenhauer knew, was no small thing. He did not believe art saves us permanently, but he believed it reveals something crucial, that suffering is not the only mode of consciousness available to us, that there are states of perception untouched by desire, that the world, briefly, can be experienced without pain. If you find yourself drawn to music, literature, cinema, or visual beauty not for inspiration or motivation, but for quiet relief, you are aligned with Schopenhauer's insight. You are not chasing happiness. You are seeking silence from the will. And in a world that never stops demanding, that silence is precious. Number 8. You believe compassion comes from shared suffering, not moral theory. They talk about kindness as a principle, a value, a rule. But when real suffering appears, messy, inconvenient, Unresolved, they grow uncomfortable, distant, impatient. Schopenhauer believed true compassion does not come from ideals. It comes from recognition, from seeing yourself in another's pain. For him, morality was not rooted in duty, commandments, or abstract reasoning. It was rooted in suffering. Specifically, in the realization that the pain you feel is not unique, that others are driven by the same blind will, trapped in the same cycles of desire, fear, loss, and frustration. Compassion, in this sense, is not noble. It is honest. Schopenhauer believed that when you truly understand suffering not intellectually, but viscerally, you stop seeing others as competitors, obstacles, or moral projects. You see them as fellow sufferers, not equal in circumstance, but equal in condition. This is why shallow optimism undermines compassion. If you believe suffering is optional, temporary, or self-inflicted, it becomes easy to judge, easy to blame, easy to explain away pain rather than acknowledge it. Schopenhauer rejected this entirely. He believed suffering was inevitable, structural, and unavoidable. No amount of moral instruction changes that. And once you accept this, your relationship to others shifts. You stop asking why someone hasn't overcome their pain. You stop prescribing solutions. You stop demanding positivity. You recognize the weight they carry because you recognize it in yourself. This is not sentimental compassion. It does not promise rescue. It does not claim to fix anything. It simply refuses to add cruelty to suffering. Schopenhauer believed that the deepest ethical act was restraint, not exploiting others' weakness, not increasing their suffering for personal gain, not pretending life is fair when it clearly is not. This kind of compassion is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not perform goodness. It listens. It tolerates silence. It allows pain to exist without immediately trying to sanitize it. People who have not suffered deeply often misunderstand this. They confuse compassion with encouragement, with advice, with positivity. Schopenhauer understood that encouragement can sometimes be another form of violence, an insistence that reality should be different than it is. True compassion does not argue with pain. It stands beside it. This is why shared suffering creates deeper bonds than shared happiness. Happiness isolates. It is private, fleeting, competitive. Suffering universalizes. It reminds us that beneath all roles, ambitions, and identities, we are equally vulnerable. Schopenhauer believed this recognition dissolved ego boundaries. When you see others not as separate wills competing with yours, but as expressions of the same blind force, moral superiority collapses. Judgment softens. Cruelty loses its justification. This does not make life kinder, but it makes you less cruel. And for Schopenhauer, that was the highest ethical achievement available to human beings. If you find yourself less interested in moral debates and more attuned to pain yours and others, you are not becoming cold. You are becoming realistic. You are grounding compassion in what is actually shared, not what is idealized. In a world that explains suffering away, Schopenhauer's compassion does something radical. It admits it exists. It admits it hurts. And it refuses to lie about either. Number 9. You distrust society's obsession with success and pleasure. You sense most pursuits are distractions. The endless chase for money, recognition, status, pleasure, visibility. The way people exhaust themselves climbing ladders they never stop to question. The way achievement is treated as proof of a life well lived, even when the achiever looks hollow, restless, and perpetually dissatisfied. Schopenhauer saw this obsession clearly, and he had no illusions about it. For him, society's fixation on success and pleasure was not a sign of progress. It was a symptom of denial. The modern world teaches you that happiness is something you earn, accumulate, or unlock if you play the game correctly. Get the right job, build the right image, acquire the right experiences, maximize pleasure, minimize discomfort. But Schopenhauer believed this entire framework was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of human existence. Pleasure, he argued, is not a positive state. It is merely the temporary absence of pain. When you satisfy a desire, what you feel is not fulfillment, but relief. And relief fades quickly. The will, that blind engine of wanting, immediately generates a new lack, a new hunger, a new dissatisfaction. This is why success never feels like arrival. The moment you reach it, it dissolves into maintenance, anxiety, and the fear of loss. Schopenhauer saw society as a massive machine designed to keep people distracted from this truth. Success gives the will something to chase. Pleasure gives it something to anticipate. Achievement gives it something to justify its suffering with. None of it ends the cycle. It only decorates it. This is why you feel uneasy watching people sacrifice their health, relationships, inner peace, and time for abstract rewards. You sense that the payoff is illusory, that the applause fades, that the pleasure dulls, that the anxiety remains. You see that most pursuits are not paths to fulfillment, but elaborate ways of staying busy enough to avoid confronting emptiness. Schopenhauer did not believe this made people stupid. He believed it made them desperate. The world rewards distraction, because distraction keeps the will moving. A person who is always striving has no space to reflect. A person who is always entertained has no time to notice their suffering. A person obsessed with success rarely asks whether the goal itself is worth the cost. This is why he distrusted optimism and progress narratives. They promise meaning in the future while extracting life in the present. They convince people to endure misery now in exchange for a fulfillment that never arrives. If you feel alienated by this culture of endless striving, it is not because you lack ambition. It is because you see the structure underneath it. You see that success does not quiet the will, it amplifies it. You see that pleasure does not heal dissatisfaction, it postpones it. You see that society is not guiding people toward peace, but toward perpetual motion. Schopenhauer believed the wisest response was not rebellion or moral outrage, but withdrawal of belief. To stop expecting salvation from systems that are structurally incapable of providing it. To stop measuring life by standards that deepen suffering rather than relieve it. This does not mean rejecting work, comfort, or enjoyment entirely. It means seeing them clearly for what they are. Temporary distractions, not solutions. Means, not ends. Relief, not fulfillment. If you no longer believe success will save you, if pleasure feels shallow rather than sacred, if society's goals strike you as frantic rather than meaningful, you are not becoming cynical. You are becoming disillusioned in the truest philosophical sense. And for Schopenhauer, disillusionment was the beginning of wisdom. Number 10. You feel life is endurance, not fulfillment. Survival feels more honest than happiness. Have you ever felt that the language of happiness doesn't quite fit your experience of being alive? That life feels less like a journey toward fulfillment and more like something you endure, day after day, desire after desire, loss after loss. You function, you adapt, you persist, but the idea that life is meant to make you happy feels strangely dishonest. Schopenhauer would say this is not a failure of attitude. It is clarity. For him, life was not designed for fulfillment. This is the most difficult and most honest part of his philosophy. Schopenhauer believed that existence itself is structured around suffering, not as punishment, not as moral lesson, but as consequence. The consequence of being a creature driven by endless wanting in a world that cannot satisfy it. To expect happiness from such a structure, he argued, is to misunderstand it entirely. Life oscillates between pain and boredom. When you lack what you want, you suffer. When you get what you want, you grow bored, restless, or anxious about losing it. There is no stable point of satisfaction, no lasting equilibrium, only movement. This is why endurance feels more accurate than fulfillment. Endurance does not promise meaning. It does not romanticize pain. It simply acknowledges reality and asks one question: how can I suffer less, rather than how can I be happy? Schopenhauer believed this shift in orientation was crucial. The pursuit of happiness sets people up for constant disappointment. It treats suffering as a mistake, a malfunction, something that should not be happening. Endurance treats suffering as expected. It removes the added pain of feeling cheated by reality. When you stop demanding happiness from life, something subtle changes. You become less angry at existence, less resentful of others, less shocked by disappointment. You begin to conserve energy rather than constantly spending it on hope. This does not make life joyful, but it makes it steadier. Schopenhauer did not believe in redemption through fulfillment. He believed in mitigation, in reducing harm, in minimizing suffering, in finding quiet, limited forms of relief rather than grand promises of joy. This is why solitude mattered to him, why compassion mattered, why art mattered, why detachment mattered. Not because they made life meaningful in a cosmic sense, but because they made it bearable. If you feel that surviving with dignity is more realistic than chasing happiness, you are not broken. You are refusing a narrative that does not match experience. You are choosing honesty over fantasy. This perspective is deeply unpopular in a culture obsessed with positivity. But Schopenhauer would say, positivity is often cruelty disguised as encouragement. It tells people they should feel fulfilled in a world that systematically frustrates them. It turns suffering into a personal failure rather than a shared condition. Endurance removes that judgment. It allows you to exist without demanding that existence justify itself. It allows you to move through life without constantly asking it to be something else. It allows you to stop fighting reality and start navigating it. Schopenhauer did not offer hope. He offered realism. And in that realism, there is a strange calm. Not the calm of happiness, but the calm of no longer being deceived, of no longer waiting for life to deliver what it never promised. If life feels like something to be endured rather than fulfilled, you are not giving up. You are seeing clearly. And for Schopenhauer, clarity, however bleak, was the most honest form of peace a human being could reach. We arrive at the end of this journey through Schopenhauer's vision of life, and what remains is not comfort, not hope, not a promise that things will get better in any grand or permanent way. What remains is something far rarer and far more difficult to accept: honesty. Schopenhauer does not ask you to love life. He does not ask you to believe in it, to trust it, or to justify it. He asks you to see it clearly, to look at existence without the filters of optimism, progress, or moral storytelling, to recognize that wanting is endless, that satisfaction is fleeting, that pain lingers longer than pleasure, and that most of what the world offers as meaning is little more than distraction from these facts. If you recognize yourself in this philosophy, it is not because you are pessimistic by nature. It is because you have noticed the structure beneath experience. You have felt how desire regenerates itself the moment it is satisfied. You have observed how happiness evaporates while suffering leaves a residue. You have seen how intelligence deepens awareness, and with it, isolation. You have sensed how optimism often feels hollow, how success feels strangely irrelevant, how pleasure feels thin when examined too closely. Schopenhauer's great insight is not that life is cruel, but that it is indifferent. It does not arrange itself around human happiness. It does not reward virtue with peace. It does not guarantee fulfillment in exchange for effort. To demand these things from it is to add a second layer of suffering to the first, the suffering of disappointment, resentment, and confusion. This is why endurance becomes central. Endurance is not resignation. It is the refusal to lie to oneself. It is the decision to stop measuring life against ideals it was never built to meet. When you accept that existence is something to be navigated rather than conquered, survived rather than completed, you begin to conserve energy. You stop raging against what cannot be changed. You stop chasing fantasies that drain you. You begin to move more carefully, more gently, more honestly. Within this framework, compassion becomes real, not as a moral performance, but as recognition. When you understand that everyone is struggling under the same blind pressure of desire, that everyone is trying to endure in their own way, cruelty becomes harder to justify. Empathy stops being theoretical. It becomes instinctive. Solitude too finds its place, not as escape, but as relief. Distance from noise, ambition, and constant stimulation gives the will fewer hooks to pull on you. In quiet, the pressure loosens, the mind softens. For a moment, you are not striving, not comparing, not chasing. You are simply existing, and that is enough. Art, beauty, and music emerge as brief sanctuaries. Not solutions, not cures, but pauses. Moments where the will releases its grip and consciousness rests. These moments matter not because they give meaning to life, but because they interrupt its suffering. Schopenhauer does not promise liberation from pain. He offers mitigation, reduction, awareness, a way of living that does not multiply suffering through false expectations. In a world obsessed with happiness, this may sound bleak, but there is a strange peace in no longer demanding joy from a system that cannot provide it. To live life the Schopenhauer way is not to despair. It is to stop being surprised by reality. It is to stop interpreting suffering as a personal failure. It is to move through existence with lowered illusions and sharpened perception. It is to endure without bitterness, to withdraw without hatred, to observe without clinging. This philosophy will never be popular. It does not sell hope. It does not motivate crowds. It does not flatter the human ego. But for those who feel alienated by shallow optimism, exhausted by endless striving, and unmoved by promises of fulfillment, it offers something far more valuable than happiness. It offers clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the only peace that remains.